Hello, Summer 141ers. So for week 3, this is the lecture you're going to get. You guys have been doing a great job in Zoom. So I really just try to think of things that add to the book, and there's a lot going on in these 3 chapters, so I don't want to pile on you. So instead, or 2 chapters, excuse me, I want to talk about 2 things. Number 1, where does the marginal revenue curve come from? And number 2, why does monopolistic competition, MC, why does it look like monopoly? So the marginal revenue curve, it comes from 2 very different places when we're looking at a competitive environment versus monopoly. If it's a competitive environment, the individual firm is saying, well, here's my marginal cost of production, and here's marginal revenue, and that came from over here, the big old market that said, hey, this shall be the equilibrium price. Well, that's what marginal revenue is. And you don't change that marginal revenue because you're just a little, or you don't change the price because you're just a little tiny firm. That's where it comes from. But now we have this idea where we've got a demand curve and a marginal revenue curve that's not only downward sloping, it's really downward sloping. And we say that the monopolist does the same thing that any firm does. They set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, which is the same thing as the supply curve. That sets the market quantity. Demand is still the relationship between price and quantity. And this elevated price is my new monopoly price, which is substantially higher than what the price would have been if the market were competitive. And our loss to society comes from the fact that the monopolist, they extract surplus. They get this big old chunk of producer surplus. Consumers are left here. They extract some consumer surplus by restricting output. And restricting output means there's less stuff to enjoy, and that, of course, is a bad thing. But the question is, where does that stinking marginal revenue curve come from? Why is it twice as steep as the demand curve? Now, there's the derivation from calculus and algebra standpoint is in the textbook, and that pretty much goes like this. Well, if demand is equal to 20 minus 4QD, and if I say I know that total revenue is equal to price times quantity, and I want to solve some sort of problem, I really can only have one variable. And since price is equal to this term, I can substitute this whole term in for P. So total revenue is equal to 20 minus 4Q times Q, or 20Q minus 4Q squared. Now, what does that look like? Well, that means that as the firm produces more, their total revenue goes up, but it has a maximum. And the reason why it has a maximum is because the general form of total revenue is a parabola, and it has a max. Well, how do we find what that max is? Well, we have to differentiate it. We have to find what the slope of it is, and we could then set that equal to 0, and that would tell us what our maximum total revenue is, but it would also tell us where our marginal revenue is equal to 0. So if total revenue is equal to 20Q minus 4Q squared, marginal revenue is then equal to 20 minus 8Q. And if we set that equal to 0, 20 minus 8Q being equal to 0, 20 equals 8Q, divide both sides by 8, and Q is equal to 2.5, and that's where our total revenue would be maximized in this case if we had this demand curve of 20 minus 4Q, which would be very limited in its context. Or we could think about, we do this in a very step-by-step way. Let's make this P is equal to 200 minus 4Q. So if we want to sell one and we're the monopolist, P is equal to 200 minus 4 times 1, and my price is equal to 196. So when my quantity is 1, my price is 196, and my total revenue is 196. If I want to sell 2, 200 minus 4 times 2, my price is now 192, but my marginal revenue for the second unit that I produce isn't 192 because my total revenue is now 384, and 384 minus 196 is 188. So my total revenue increased by 188 even though we sold the second item for 192. We also sold the first one for $192. We're what's called a single price monopolist. That means we charge one price and everybody pays the same price. We can't discriminate high value consumers from low value consumers. So if we're looking at this big old demand, marginal revenue, here's our marginal cost, P star, that's the profit maximizing price that corresponds to Q star. Now this brings about an interesting analysis. We have a tiny amount of consumer surplus, we have some producer surplus here, and we have some producer surplus here. The monopolist might say, gosh, you know what, from Q star to QPC for competition, consumers' willingness to pay is higher than my cost. Is there a way that I can take this market and not have it affect this market? That's where we end up with product segmentation. Firms, beer companies are a great example of this. We're going to sell Bud Light, we're going to advertise it and make a bunch of money on that, and then we're going to not advertise Natural Light or some inferior beer, and we're going to segment that market even though to some extent it's basically the same thing. Which is my segue into why does monopolistic competition look like monopoly? And the answer is quite simple, because it really is kind of the same thing as monopoly with one big catch. So, again, we have a marginal revenue curve and a marginal cost curve, the exact same analysis. The difference is this elevated price corresponds with an average total cost curve that shows zero economic profit in the long run. Differentiated markets are ones where firms have just carved off a niche. They've figured out a way to make consumers think that their product is somehow different, even though it's really not any fundamentally different than other competitors or even generic equivalencies. But they get you to believe that they're different by adding different features, warranties that cost them money, or by advertising. All of these things add to their cost, which drives their profit away. Monopolies have real barriers to entry whereby they don't have competitors. Monopolistically competitive firms do have competitors. They have the ability to mark up their product, but to keep that market power, they have to advertise the heck out of it or continually develop new functionality or new features to keep their market power. Okay. The final model today, and just a little added content, is oligopoly. An oligopoly encompasses a lot of things, but what is true in all oligopoly is, number one, there's few firms, there's interdependence, and there are barriers to entry. So number one, few. How few is few? Few that they all matter. When one does something, the rest take note. Number two, interdependence. When one firm does something, because there are so few of them, either it could help or it could hurt others. And three, barriers to entry is why there's few. You've got to be really, really big to be part of the market. Now, the different models that are spelled out in the textbook, it's not like one model holds fast and true to one model of oligopoly. So that kink demand curve model or the price rigidity model is telling you about, well, why is it that soda seems to be the same price? And it's because of interdependence. If Coke raises their price, Pepsi's not going to follow. They're going to gobble up all the Coke drinkers that don't have a preference between Coke and Pepsi. But if one lowers their price, the other one has to follow if they want to keep their market share. And so it gives us an understanding of the competitive or the competition between the two. Another example would be the Bertrand model. Airlines, we see this in all the time. How do airlines compete? When you're on a plane, do you even really know if you're flying Delta or United or American? No, the seat's uncomfortable and the service is bad no matter where you are, and you just pray and cross your fingers that you're going to land safely. So there, they just compete on price. They compete on price until there's no profit left. So that model explains that industry that is an oligopoly, even though it has different outcomes than other models of oligopoly, like light-duty pickup trucks, where we know Ford, General Motors, Ram, and even Toyota and Nissan are making money hand over fist on pickup trucks, where that's a little different model of interdependence. All right, I hope to see you tomorrow. You guys are doing great. Keep it up. We're about half done.